Hi everyone, and welcome back to Art 110. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of creative thinking and how to begin to strengthen our creative muscles in an effort to build up our creative confidence. So we're going to be talking a little bit today about convergent thinking and divergent thinking, and we're also going to be exploring the idea of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. We're going to get started in the lecture today. We'll get about halfway through the content. What we don't cover today, we'll pick up in the next lecture. So just to let you know, we're going to kind of move halfway through. We'll pause the lecture at that point, and then we'll pick up with the rest of the content in the next video lecture, try to break that amount of information up into two segments there. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to the PowerPoint today. We actually get to talk about artists today. I know that we've talked a lot about creative thinking. We've talked a lot about the idea of how to use our creativity for this future that we really don't know what that future looks like at this point, but how to build up our creative confidence for that. And today we get to talk about artists that have actually been there and have gone through some of the things that we've been talking about over the next few lectures. The last 2 points of the lecture that I have that we'll be covering today, I actually have a couple of video links. One to a very short film that I'll reference within the lecture. I'll include that link on the announcements. The last point that we'll cover during this lecture today will be accompanied by a music video. So we'll be talking about how that applies to creativity, and I will also give you the link to that music video in the announcement as well. So we'll go ahead and jump to the PowerPoint as we begin to talk about creative thinking. So our theme today is the idea of taking creative risks. As we start to become creative thinkers, how does that look like on a day-to-day basis? And what does that look like as we begin to build up our creativity? And I've got a quote to kind of launch us from as we begin our discussion about taking creative risks. And that quote is there on the screen. The difference between creative people and innovative people is action. A lot of us can maybe come up with some great ideas once we start our brainstorming session, but the attitude here is we have another step to that process, not just idea generation, but action. So we're going to talk about the concept of taking action, taking creative risks today. But before we start really talking about creativity, I want to show you the image of a coat hanger. Now, some of you are like, I'm not quite sure how this is visual art. I'm just staring at a basic wire coat hanger. But this is actually a wonderful example of approaching our jobs, approaching our life with this creative mindset. And it also is a great example of taking creative risk and what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. Now, when I put the image up on the screen, most of us identified it instantly. This is a coat hanger. For many of us, this is a coat hanger. It's all it's ever been. It's all it ever will be. It's just a functional, basic coat hanger. But what if, remember, that's our big question as we become creative individuals. What if I asked you to turn this basic wire coat hanger into something functional? And what if I told you that you couldn't turn it into a back scratcher, or you couldn't turn it into a car unlocking device? So what if I removed maybe your plan A? Maybe your immediate thought was, okay, I'll turn it into a back scratcher. Let's take that off the table. Maybe you thought of, well, this is a way I can kind of shimmy my way into a car and unlock the car. I'm going to take that off the table as well. So I removed your plan A. I removed your default plan B. What could you possibly turn this coat hanger into if I gave you, let's say, 3 minutes to turn it into a functional object other than the things that I just mentioned. Some of you may think, well, I could turn it into a basketball hoop that could be hooked onto the back of a door and kind of make a makeshift basketball game out of it. Maybe some of you thought, well, this could be used, I could bend it and it could be used as a marshmallow toaster over a campfire. That's another possible solution. Maybe you're looking at this and you think, well, I could use this to hang something from in the laundry room. If I had something that couldn't be put in the dryer, I could use this as kind of like a makeshift laundry hanger. So whatever ideas that you came up with, those are a way of looking at a solution in multiple different ways. And maybe you came up with some other creative potential that this coat hanger could have. So what we've done here is we've used our coat hanger and we've viewed it in a different way. And we've looked at it with a creative mindset. Okay, if this is no longer a coat hanger and I can't use it as a back scratcher and I can't use it as a way to unlock my car, what is the potential? What could this object become? Now, we started off by talking about a coat hanger, but what this actually is a great way to demonstrate the idea of a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And let's just define those very quickly. A fixed mindset is when we approach a problem and we only see it maybe in one way. And for many of us, if we find ourselves in a fixed mindset, we'll say the phrase, well, we've always done it this way. We've always educated young people this way. We've always conducted church this way, and we've always run a company this way. And what that happens is we become fixed in the way that we approach problems. We look at that coat hanger and all we see is a coat hanger. We cannot see it as anything else. This has always been a coat hanger. It will always be a coat hanger. When we look at our lives and we look at our jobs with a fixed mindset, we tend to think that intelligence and talent or skill are fixed and unlikely to change. And I know that I've found myself in this place sometimes, even as a creative individual, I will find myself kind of sinking into a fixed mindset. And this happens when we say things like, well, I've never been good at sports, so I never will be. I'll never be able to enjoy that because I'm not good at it. Or maybe we tell ourselves, I wasn't really good in that art class. I'm not a creative person. I never will be. That's just meant for some people in the population. It's not meant for me. A fixed mindset says, I never was really good at school. I must not be a smart individual, so there's no potential for growth. That is having a fixed mindset, only looking at that coat hanger as being a coat hanger. However, contrasted to that is having a growth mindset. Growth mindset asks that powerful question, what if? What if I picked up a sport even though I maybe wasn't good at it as a child? Maybe I can approach it again, and maybe I've changed as an individual. What if I took that math class, even though I think that I'm not good in math? Maybe if I approached it differently and I took a different kind of math, maybe I am actually better at it than I think. Having a growth mindset means that we believe that abilities can be discovered, developed, and strengthened. What if I signed up for that art class online, and what if I found out that I actually had a lot more creative potential than I thought that I did? Maybe art is bigger than just that art project that I had in middle school that I didn't do well at. What if I took a risk and tried something and found out that abilities can actually be discovered, developed, and strengthened? That is having a growth mindset. That's looking at the coat hanger and thinking about all the possibilities that it could be and should be. That's having a growth mindset. So hopefully when we think about that, we think about that coat hanger. I also want to show you a really good example of how this looks on a day-to-day basis, what creativity and creative thinking and problem solving can result in. And I found a really good example of this when I was doing some research on creativity. And when we talk about creative thinking and we talk about creative risk taking, we talked about, having limitation. We talked about that a few lectures ago. The idea that we're never going to have an unlimited budget. We're never really going to have unlimited resources. So how do we be creative when we're faced with limitation? And I found a great example of this. Public school system in San Francisco that was facing a challenge. Most of their students are low-income students, and they are on a free and reduced lunch program. Now, with the kind of environment that they had with a lot of low-income students, lunch was becoming an issue. A lot of the students, because they were either embarrassed or they didn't have money left in their account for their lunch program, a lot of the students were just simply not eating during lunch. Now, that's a problem. It's a problem on a physical level. You've got kids that are facing hunger issues, but it was also causing problems in the classroom. If you don't have the proper nutrition, if you don't have food in your belly, it makes it very difficult to be successful in the classroom. So they were noticing not only were the students skipping lunch, but behavioral issues were increasing, discipline issues were becoming something that they were having to deal with. So the issue of lunch needed to be solved. Now, as most of you guys know, public school systems don't have a lot of money. There's not unlimited resources. So they had to address, how do we tackle this issue of students at lunchtime? How do we tackle the issue of them struggling with what meals they were going to get? Some of the students were not able to get a hot lunch if they owed money on their lunch balance, so they were given a cold sandwich, and of course that creates issues in terms of peer pressure and students that felt embarrassed because they were eating a cold lunch where everyone else had a hot lunch. So how do we redesign our space with limited resources, limited budget, to encourage low-income students to eat well during lunch? So this is what they did. Instead of having a traditional cafeteria line where the students had to present their card and they may or may not be eligible for lunch that day, they set up an iPad. Very cost effective. iPad goes up on the wall. The students, instead of facing the lunch line with a card that may or may not be functional that day, they just punch their name on the iPad. The iPad then directs them towards the lunch for that day. And as you can tell, they're kind of arranged in bags over there on the left-hand side. Right-hand image has the different options for that day. So instead of being told that they had to eat a certain lunch, the students then were in control. They walk over, they get the lunch that the iPad tells them they're able to get that day. They're able to make some choices, and you're not faced with this idea of some kids getting lunch and some kids weren't getting lunch. So it simply created a more welcoming, student-centered cafeteria experience. Not a lot of money invested in this. The same lunches were served. The same packaging was served with those lunches, but the students felt more in control. They were able to go up, they were able to get the lunch for that day, and it really solved a lot of different issues for that. They noticed that more students were eating lunch, the discipline problems decreased, the behavioral problems decreased because the kids were getting fed. So that's a great example of having a growth mindset, of being able to approach a problem with limited resources, and simply by approaching it differently, seeing different solutions, they were able to ultimately benefit all the students in the environment. So let's talk a little bit about convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Now, if you're familiar with these terms, you're probably thinking that I'm going to tell you that one form of thinking is better than the other. And I'm actually not going to tell you that. I'm going to tell you about how we need both types of thinking to be creative individuals. So let's go ahead and define these, and then we'll kind of talk about how using both of these skills can make us stronger creatively. Convergent thinking is the process of finding a single best solution to a problem that you're trying to solve. Now, you may find yourself kind of on this side of thinking, on this spectrum of thinking. Maybe you are a very logical, systematic thinker. If you find that you tend to think that way, then you're probably a convergent thinker. There's a logical way to solve a problem. You think about the pros and the cons, you come up with a viable solution, and you typically find a single best solution to a problem that you're trying to solve. I know that my dad is a lot like this. My dad's an accountant. He's all about the numbers. He's all about spreadsheets. So he tends to be a very logical and systematic convergent thinker. Then we have divergent thinking, which is the process of creating many unique solutions in order to solve a problem. If you find yourself as a divergent thinker, then you tend to be very spontaneous. You tend to kind of have a ability to generate multiple ideas to a solution, very free-flowing in your problem-solving ability. As you can probably guess, I'm a divergent thinker, right? Like if you give me a problem, I will immediately start to brainstorm and I come up with all different kinds of solutions. So I tend to be more spontaneous with my thinking. I can generate ideas very quickly. However, I'm not a numbers person. I am not a logical, systematic thinker. I can come up with a lot of ideas, but some of them may not actually be viable. Now, the reason that we need both is because we need both sides of the spectrum. We need the spontaneous idea generation. We need people that can come up with solutions and they're not really running it through a filter, and they can generate a lot of ideas quickly. But we also need convergent thinkers to come alongside the divergent thinkers and say, those are all great ideas. Let's talk about the ones that will be sustainable. Let's talk about the ones that will work within the limited resources we have. Divergent thinkers are awesome, but we tend to not think logically, and we need people that can come alongside us and say, let's talk about the best solution that makes sense overall. Now, same side of the spectrum, convergent thinkers need divergent thinkers, because convergent thinkers will tend to get stuck. They find that one solution, they find that plan A, they stick to plan A every single time. So convergent thinkers need the divergent thinkers to come alongside them and encourage their creativity. Move past plan A, move past plan B, move past that single best solution, and think about all the possibilities. Think about all the things that that coat hanger can be. We are the strongest creatively when we collaborate. And that's something that we touched on a few lectures ago. Collaboration is where creativity occurs. Working with people that think differently than you is what makes you creatively strong. As a divergent thinker, I can generate ideas all day. I need convergent thinkers on my team that will help me narrow down my free-flowing ideas into a sustainable, responsible, workable solution. So we are the best on a team as employees, as families, as we approach this future with both convergent thinkers and divergent thinkers. We need both. Very quick quote here. You don't have to write this down in your notes, but I think this quote really summarizes what we just talked about. And this is from the Creativity Crisis. Creativity requires constant shifting, blender pulses of both divergent thinking and convergent thinking, to combine new information with old and forgotten ideas. Highly creative people are very good at marshaling their brains into bilateral mode. The more creative they are, the more they dual activate. So not only do we need that as a team, we also need our brains to function in both capacities. I'm naturally a divergent thinker, but I need to pause and become a convergent thinker and kind of have both sides of my brain working at the same time. That's when we become the most creative. As a group, as a team, as a corporation, as a church, as a family, you need both kinds of thinking. And it's very important that we not surround ourselves with people that think just like us, because we're going to get stuck in that fixed mindset if we do that. So let's talk a little bit about what divergent thinking requires. The first thing that divergent thinking requires is fluency. And fluency is the ability to generate a lot of ideas very quickly. That's why some of the projects that I give you, like the self-portrait project, I don't give you a whole lot of time to work on those, because in real life, in this future that we're headed towards, we have to be able to generate a lot of ideas very quickly. We don't have sometimes months and years to work on a project. We need to be able to generate solutions very quickly. So fluency is key to creative thinking. Divergent thinking also requires flexibility, the ability to think about different ways to approach a problem at the same time. And again, it's asking that crucial question, what if? What if that coat hanger could be bent and manipulated and in turn into a hook that can rescue a sock from out behind the dryer? You know, that's a way to work on our flexibility. What are some potential solutions to these problems that we have, and to be able to think about different ways to solve them. Divergent thinking also requires originality, which is the ability to generate ideas that most people don't consider. Now, I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit here, but I want to talk about the concept of originality. A lot of us, including myself, when we are faced with a problem, we Google it. Grab that phone, grab that iPad, hit Google, type in our problem, and boom, there's a list of different ways to solve that problem. The issue with that is that everyone else who is also facing that problem is also Googling to try to find a solution, which means that creative muscle begins to atrophy because it's not being activated. We're relying on Google to solve our problems instead of taking a moment and saying, how can I approach this problem and generate ideas? If we're always defaulting to Google, then we're always defaulting to plan A, which is what your rival company is doing. That's what the competition is doing. If they're Googling and you're Googling, then there is no original thought. There's no idea that's unique to you. So my challenge to you and to myself is the next time we're faced with a problem is to not just default to grabbing Google and typing in our issue and then doing whatever Google tells us to do. We may not even have Google in a few years. And if we do have it, then we have to assume that everyone else is also doing the same thing. So originality is the ability to generate ideas that most people don't consider. And when we push past plan A and we push past plan B and we push past our tendency to Google everything, then we start to strengthen that creative muscle and we start to come up with original ideas. The fourth and final requirement for divergent thinking is elaboration. And this is something that I'm kind of feeling like a hypocrite when I talk about it, because I tend to not be as strong with elaboration. Elaboration is the ability to carry out the ideas into a real solution. So let's say that we are on a task force to solve the parking issue at Anderson University. We have some problems parking here. If you don't live on campus, then you're not aware of this, but we have limited parking here at Anderson University, and we're a somewhat landlocked university. So if I put that problem in front of a task force and I said, listen, parking's a problem at Anderson University, what's a way to solve that? And let's say everyone goes, let's build a parking garage. We'll build a 5-story parking garage. Well, that has to be carried out into a real solution. So let's look at that. A parking garage is really expensive. So if that goes into a solution for the problem, then we're probably going to have to increase tuition. That's not going to make anybody happy. We also don't have a whole lot of land to build a big, huge parking garage. And even though that would eliminate our problem, it's probably not the most responsible thing to do. Not real sustainable. Also making a pretty bad environmental impact. We're going to mow down a bunch of trees and slap up some concrete. That's not a really sustainable idea in an environmental sense. So elaboration, even though we can come up with an idea, how does that translate into a real solution? So elaboration is the ability to take those multiple ideas and transmit them into a real viable solution that fits into our budget, that fits into our restrictions, that fits into those limitations. All right, so let's talk about some of the benefits of taking creative risks. We're going to get to point 3, and I'm going to pause the lecture at that point, and then I will continue the rest of the lecture during the next video. But let's go ahead and tackle those first 3. We actually get to talk about some artists at this point. The first benefit of the first benefit of taking risks is that we break through limitations. And sometimes those limitations are self-imposed and sometimes they're external. External limitations can be anything from budgets to facility issues to societal issues. Self-imposed limitations is the self-critic that's in our head. And we all have that soundtrack that plays in our head. Self-imposed limitations are when we believe the labels that have been put on us. You're not good at art. You never will be good at art. Or, you come from a really disfortunate, disadvantaged background and you'll never be able to kind of break that cycle. Self-imposed limitations are things like, you know what, I've always been labeled as a dumb jock. I'm good at sports, but I'm not very smart in the classroom, and I probably never will be. I shouldn't even try to take a risk because that's just not what I'm good at. So those limitations can be self-imposed or they can be external. And as an example of how we can break through limitations, I want to talk about the Vietnam Memorial. Which was designed by an architect named Maya Lin. She's still living, still working, and she is the architect who designed the Vietnam Memorial. Let me tell you a little bit about her story and how Maya Lin faced both external and self-imposed limitations and was able to break through them. Now, you probably have studied the Vietnam War in different history classes that you've had throughout your educational experience. And if you remember, the Vietnam War was a very controversial war. Some Americans felt like we had every right to be in Vietnam. Other citizens thought we had no business being in Vietnam. It wasn't our conflict. It wasn't something that we needed to be involved in as a country. So a very divisive war for the United States. After the Vietnam War was over, there was a call put out to different architects all over the world because we needed a way to kind of unite the country back together after the war, to kind of heal that wound in our country, and also a way to publicly memorialize those who had lost their lives in the war and those that were still missing. So a call goes out in the late 1970s, early 1980s, different architects all over the world to design a public space to memorialize the soldiers in the Vietnam War. Maya Lin, at the time, was an undergraduate architectural student at Yale. She was 21 years old, and she heard about this contest and immediately wanted to submit some ideas to it. Now, think about the external limitations here. I'm going to put a picture of Maya Lin up on the screen as a student. She's 21 years old. She is an unknown architectural student at Yale, has never designed anything that's actually been built. And she's going toe-to-toe with some of the best-known architects in the world architects whose buildings had been celebrated all throughout history. And here's Maya Lin as an unknown architecture student, just basically a kid who wants to throw her hat in the ring against these incredible architects, global architects. So already some external limitations. Maya Lin's also a woman at a time that architecture was a male-dominated field, and here she comes in. Again, another external limitation, a woman in a male-dominated business. Maya Lin was also of Asian descent, and again, we're talking about a really tumultuous time period, and here she is as a minority that's throwing her hat in the ring in this contest. True story here. Maya Lin was in the dining hall one night at Yale, and she's thinking about this contest, and she's thinking about these limitations that are already put against her, and the limitations that she's putting on herself as a student. And she was eating mashed potatoes in the dining hall, and she's thinking about what she would submit as a design concept for the Vietnam Memorial. And she begins to think about the concept of a scar. Now, a scar is where you have been wounded, but it has healed over and actually become stronger. So a scar is a wound that's healed. And through that healing process, the skin has actually been strengthened and becomes tougher through the healing process than it ever was before it was injured. And she's kind of shoving her mashed potatoes, and she thinks about the concept of a scar in the earth. And as she's thinking about this concept, she's using her knife to push the mashed potatoes, kind of like a scar. And what would it look like if the Vietnam Memorial didn't look like the other memorials? What if it didn't have soldiers or figures in it? What if it was a scar that went down into the earth? So a scar shows that we've been wounded, but it also shows as a country we're in the process of healing from that wound. And again, powerful question. What if this scar, this memorial, was made out of highly polished granite, which becomes reflective? So as you walk down into the scarred earth and you're reading the names of the missing and the dead, you also see your face reflected in the granite. So Maya Lin submits her design, and she won. And the Vietnam Memorial has her as the designing architect. It's very intentional. Now, the memorial itself, because it was so untraditional, it was met with its own controversy. A lot of people didn't like the kind of modern design. It didn't look like the other memorials. But Maya Lin was able to break through those limitations. And in breaking those limitations, she gave us one of the most thought-provoking and one of the most profound memorials there in the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Number 2 on our list is that you learn to fail forward. When we take creative risks, we learn to fail forward. Now, for most of us, failure is absolutely, we think, the worst thing that can happen to us. We're not supposed to make mistakes. But to be creative, we are going to make mistakes. You can't be creative without failing a few times. And I want to talk about how we learn to fail forward by actually talking about one of the biggest failures in creative history. On your screen, you see a somewhat awkward family photograph of the Lumiere brothers. So the Lumiere brothers were actually photographers, and we're talking about 1895 at the kind of the birthplace of motion pictures. This idea of transferring still photographs into actual moving live pictures that were caught on film. The Lumiere brothers actually developed the first film projector. So think about this. It's 1895. The whole concept of motion pictures is new. How do we show motion pictures projected so that an audience can enjoy them? We had a way to enjoy them personally, but there was no way to kind of project those images up onto a surface. The Lumiere brothers developed the first light lighted film projector, which is kind of strange because their name is Lumiere and Lumiere means light, but that's a good way for you to remember it. So the Lumiere brothers decide they're going to debut their light projector, this new invention, and they made a 50-second film called The Arrival of a Train at a Station, 50 seconds long. And I'm going to put the link in the announcements when I send out the link to the lecture, so you can click on this if you want to. It's a 50-second movie, and I'm going to give you the spoiler alert for this. The plot of the 50-second film is a train arriving at a station. So the Lumiere brothers bring in all their friends. We're going to show you this new invention. Now, keep in mind that the audience that they had that night, Little Tiny Cafe, had never ever seen a movie projected large up on a surface. They had never seen that before. And all of a sudden, the lights go out, the film projector starts, and there's a train coming at the audience. True story. They thought that there was actually a train coming at them. They had never seen this before. So, incredible failure. People started screaming. They started shoving each other out of the way. They started jumping over tables to try to get out of the path of this train that was seemingly coming at them through the wall. So it was a huge failure. The Lumiere brothers gave up. They said, you know what? Film has no future. Now, clearly they were wrong, because it's now a time where we can create entire movies out of characters that don't exist in nature, but they gave up. Now, fortunately, Thomas Edison picked up where they left off. They let failure define them, which is why we're not familiar with the name Lumiere. Thomas Edison took that failure, and as a result, we know the name Thomas Edison because he refused to let failure stop him. He picked up from their failure, continued on, and we now know Thomas Edison for the inventor that he was. So I'm going to put that link, and you guys can watch that if you want to. The Arrival of a Train at a Station. It's interesting. Number 3 on our list, and the last one that we will cover in this lecture before we pick it up on the next lecture, is that you become more creative when you take risks. Remember, that muscle gets stronger when it meets resistance. You don't get stronger by just joining a gym. You don't get stronger by just showing up at the gym and sitting in the lobby. You have to continuously challenge your muscles, and through that resistance, through that struggle, you actually become stronger. Same thing with creativity. The more you take those risks, the more that you make yourself vulnerable, the more that you adhere to a growth mindset, the more that you strengthen your convergent thinking and your divergent thinking, the more that you surround yourself with people who think differently than you, the more creative you become. I'm going to include a link to a music video that illustrates point 3. And this is by one of my favorite groups called OK Go. If you know much about their group, you know that they make exceptionally creative music videos. And the link that I'm going to include for you to watch is a music video for their song, One Moment. Now let me give you a few facts about this song. OK Go loves to challenge themselves with limitations when they make music videos. And in this case, they gave themselves somewhat the ultimate limitation, which is, can we film an entire music video in less than 5 seconds? And they did. The music video that I'm going to give you the link to is actually only 4.2 seconds long. So the ultimate in time limitation, can we make a music video in less than 5 seconds? And they did. So they filmed a music video that took 4.2 seconds to film. Within that 4.2 seconds, there are 318 different visual events. There are 54 color salt bursts and 23 exploding paint buckets. You don't have to write all that down, but as you watch the video, you can look for these things. What they then did is they slowed that music video down so that it would fit the 4-minute song. Now, that involves math. All right, so there's that wonderful intersection of convergent thinking and divergent thinking. And if you're really into math, you can actually look at the spreadsheet that OKGo used to synchronize the events happening to the beat of the music and make that all fit. So if you're of the math, logical, systematic thinking camp, you can actually look for that information online. They made that spreadsheet available and how they did the math. As you're watching the music video too, you'll notice that each one of the events is synchronized to the beat of the music. Again, that all goes back to math. So using creative thinking, convergent thinking, divergent thinking, putting limitations, and then the result from that is a wonderfully cool visual, innovative and creative music video. All right, I'm going to go back to the screen here. I will include those links with this video link, so when you get to those points, you can just click on those and watch them for yourselves. I would encourage you to do that. There's some really cool stuff in there once you move past the train arriving at the station and watch the OKGo video. It's really cool to see that kind of in play. So I'm going to pause there. When we come back next time, we'll pick up on the other points and the other benefits of taking creative risks, but that's enough for today. And I hope you guys have an amazing day. Thank you so much for joining us today.